It's May 31st, 2024, and President Joe Biden has made an important decision. The US will allow Ukraine to use some of the weapons it supplies to strike Russia in Russian territory. It's a massive departure from the stance the United States has taken since the beginning of the war, as it had previously only allowed Ukraine to use American-made weapons in Ukraine itself. The change in stance also comes with a condition. Ukraine can only use American weapons in the Kharkiv region, which has become the site of the latest Russian advance. Still, the move is part of a trend within NATO, with America's decision coming off the back of several countries, including the United Kingdom, claiming that Ukraine can use the weapons it supplies in whatever way Ukraine sees fit. Russian President Vladimir Putin is furious. He orders a senior Russian security official named Dmitry Medvedev to issue a warning to the US and NATO as a whole. Russia regards all long-range weapons used by Ukraine as already being directly controlled by servicemen from NATO countries. This is no military assistance, this is participation in a war against us. Medvedev, clearly speaking for Putin, labeled the decision a casus belli. In other words, it's an act that could provoke a war between NATO and Russia. With this warning, Russia hopes to communicate to NATO that it should keep out of Ukraine because failure to do so could lead the organization to having to face off against the Russian Federation. Putin hopes to intimidate NATO. The problem is that this threat won't work. It's 2 months after Biden allowed Ukraine to start using American weapons inside Russia, and the US hasn't backed down. Putin's threat failed for a simple reason. NATO is stronger now than it's been at any time since the Cold War. And the great irony is that the organization has grown stronger because of the very man who is trying to intimidate it, Vladimir Putin. After all, the May 31st threat is far from the first that Putin and his cronies have thrown in NATO's direction. 2 months prior, Reuters reported on Putin's claim that any direct conflict between Russia and NATO would put the entire planet just one step away from World War III. That warning came on the back of French President Emmanuel Macron's claims that NATO could not rule out the possibility of putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. It's clear to everyone that this will be one step away from a full-scale World War III, Putin warned. I think hardly anyone is interested in this. Just as he did 2 months later, Putin was trying to intimidate NATO. And though NATO has yet to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, it's clear the intimidation didn't work. Many of its member nations are increasing funding for Ukraine while allowing their weapons to be used in Russia. Threat upon threat. Politico reported on Putin throwing around vague threats of nuclear retaliation if NATO entered Ukraine in February 2024. There have also been threats levied at Finland and Sweden, NATO's newest members, all designed by Putin to showcase Russia's strength against the 32-country alliance. None of them have worked. As we said earlier, all Putin has achieved with the combination of the Ukraine war and his constant threats is a stronger NATO that is a greater challenge to him than it's ever been before. That leads us to a question. How did we get here? To answer that question, we first need to explore NATO's strength before Putin's fatal February 2022 decision to invade Ukraine. And the truth is that for over a decade before the invasion, warning bells were ringing, both inside and outside of NATO, that the organization wasn't where it needed to be. Take former Defense Secretary Robert Gates' comment about the organization in February 2010 as an example. He claimed that NATO was in a crisis of sorts, pointing to a weakness brought on by money shortages that was undermining NATO's viability and leaving it exposed to future threats. To Gates, NATO members spending less money than he believed they should was a symptom of deeper problems with the way NATO perceives threats. In other words, NATO wasn't taking global conflict seriously enough. He cited the war in Afghanistan, which was ongoing at the time, as an example. Though Gates commended NATO for raising troop contributions from 30,000 in 2009 to 50,000 in 2010, calling this an extraordinary feat, he has also recognized the divisions within NATO made it difficult for all in the organization to align toward a single goal. The Netherlands provided a perfect example of this. Its coalition government of the time spent so much time bickering over the 2,000 troops it had sent to NATO to head to Afghanistan that it fell apart. Those troops would be withdrawn soon after. On a wider level, Gates believed that NATO's European members had leaned too far toward demilitarization, as he expressed when speaking to a National Defense University audience in 2010. The demilitarization of Europe, where large swathes of the general public and political class are averse to military force and the risks that go with it, has gone from a blessing in the 20th century to an impediment to achieving real security and lasting peace in the 21st. He warned that NATO was at risk of being considered a paper tiger, an organization with a lot of strength on paper, but an inability to back that strength up in practice if it continued on the path it was on. Worse yet for NATO, its European members risked casting themselves adrift of the US, which was still spending heavily on its military and, for some, was starting to feel like the one thing propping NATO up. These concerns were examined further by the Atlantic Council in 2011. It pointed out that the previous 2 years had seen NATO's European members reduce their defense budgets by a collective $45 billion, equivalent to Germany's entire defense budget at the time. The gap was growing. NATO members had started the 2010s further apart than ever before in terms of their defense investments, with the US being forced to carry the heaviest burden. For instance, 2001 saw the US account for a little under half of NATO's total defense spending. By 2011, that share was closer to 75%, leaving many in the US feeling as though they were footing the bill for a Europe that was happy to demilitarize because it felt it had no direct threats. These changes in funding were even reflected in operations, according to the Atlantic Council. European members focused more on soft power assignments, such as providing humanitarian aid and offering training, while the US was left to deal with the hard power aspects of actual defense. Risks were being created, the first of which was increasing division within Europe. The Atlantic Council pointed out that the decrease in European spending wasn't universal, leaving the major European nations in a position where they would become the continent's only security providers as smaller NATO member nations continued to reduce their spending. That would defeat the purpose of NATO and go against the principle of collective defense, creating the potential for division. That would also lead to the second risk, a weaker Europe unable to confront the threats it faced. At the time, Russia wasn't seen as one of those imminent threats, but by cutting funding, many of NATO's European members were showcasing a blasé attitude toward their need to be able to defend themselves in the future. These issues would continue for the next decade. Consternation over European members and their defense budgets persisted, and Europe as a whole began to feel like less of a threat to imperialist powers, such as Russia, as a result. NATO was weakening, which opened the door for Putin to start putting some of his more militaristic plans into action. He'd already fired a warning shot in 2008 when he started a war with Georgia. In 2014, Putin annexed Crimea, essentially making his intentions for Ukraine known, about 8 years before he finally launched an invasion. The warning signs were there, but still, NATO ignored them. By 2021, defense commentators were pointing out that NATO needed to change the way it approached Russia. One of those commentators was Fyodor A. Lukyanov, the editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs and a member of the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. He claimed that the careful truce between East and West that followed the reunification of Germany in 1990 had been systematically dismantled, blaming NATO's focus on waging a political and ideological crusade as the main reason. Lukyanov said that the military aspect of the organization, the collective defense it was formed to offer, had spent too long coming in second to this political expansion. Mutual support existed in theory, he said, but nobody in NATO was actually expecting to have to fight a war with Russia or to come to the aid of smaller members such as Latvia and Slovakia. The biggest problem with this approach, he says, is that NATO never evolved its thinking about Russia from the 1990s to the present day. That lack of evolution would come back to bite NATO by February 2022. Russia's hints of aggression over the previous 15 years materialized into a full-blown invasion of Ukraine, forcing NATO into a position where it had to rethink its entire approach. The weakening of the previous decades had to be reversed. European members could no longer afford to cut their defense budgets, especially given Putin's reasoning for the Ukraine invasion being so heavily rooted in Russia's historical claims to the territory. If Putin could make those claims to justify the invasion, what would stop him from making the same claims to justify attacking some of NATO's members such as the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia? All three are former members of the Soviet bloc and could be targets for Putin should he be victorious in Ukraine. NATO was essentially caught with its pants down, at least in Europe. However, not even Putin could have predicted that his actions would lead to a complete revitalization of the organization or shifting of its focus back toward the collective defense it was always supposed to offer. The 2.5 years since the invasion of Ukraine has only seen NATO grow stronger. And one of the keys to that strengthening has been the introduction of new members. On April 4, 2023, Finland became the 31st member of the NATO alliance. Sweden followed suit, becoming the 32nd member on March 7, 2022. Both nations had held off from joining the alliance throughout the Cold War and in its aftermath, preferring to maintain military neutrality so that they could develop relations both with Russia and the West. Putin's invasion changed that approach. Both Finland and Sweden began to feel vulnerable in the face of Putin's rising aggression. That invasion would have brought with it echoes of the past, especially for Finland, which had found itself in a similar situation in 1939 when the Soviet Union invaded. Though the country resisted Russia for several months, it ended up losing the eastern province of Karelia, which accounted for about 10% of its territory. Sweden has been no less a potential target over the last decade. In 2013, Russian bomber planes simulated an attack on the country, with Sweden having to call NATO in to help ward them off. Other threats came in 2014 amidst reports that a Russian submarine was hiding within the waters of the Stockholm archipelago. Putin's message was clear: I'm watching you and I'm planning my next move. Russia's actions became so worrying for Sweden that it started sending out pamphlets entitled "If Crisis or War Comes" in 2018, the first time it had done so since 1991. Here we see a literal strengthening of NATO. Militaristically, Finland is ranked as the 50th strongest nation out of 145 examined by Global Firepower, or GFP. It has a fairly small military containing only 24,000 active personnel, but Finland also institutes national service, meaning it has 870,000 reservists waiting in the wings. It also delivers an air force with 164 assets, over 11,000 armored vehicles, and the world's 11th largest navy in terms of waterborne assets with 246. Sweden is even stronger, achieving a rank of 29th out of 145. Like Finland, it has an active military of around 24,000 members, though it lags in reservists with only 32,900. It makes up for that with a stronger air force that has 212 assets and an even larger navy. Sweden's 353 naval assets means it has the 5th largest navy, according to GFP's figures. Collectively, the two countries' navies would be key to a conflict in the Baltic Sea, should one arise. So, what we see here is a literal strengthening of NATO that comes as a direct result of Putin's actions. The Russian president recognizes this too, which is why he spent much of 2022 claiming that Russia had no territorial quarrels with Sweden or Finland. However, he also claimed that if military contingents and military infrastructure were deployed there, we would be obliged to respond symmetrically and raise the same threats for those territories where threats have arisen for us. In other words, don't join NATO because Russia will be forced to fight fire with fire. Putin's threats didn't work. Finland and Sweden are now part of NATO, ending decades of neutrality in the process. Beyond this literal strengthening through expansion, Putin's actions in Ukraine have finally forced several NATO members to reconsider their defense spending. For context, NATO has a guideline in place through which it encourages all of its member nations to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product, or GDP, on defense. The biggest problem NATO faced in the last couple of decades is that very few of its members hit that percentage. In 2014, there were only 3 countries that reached or exceeded the 2% mark: the US, Greece, and the United Kingdom. That left 27 nations spending substantially less than NATO recommends on their individual defense, impacting NATO's collective defense ambitions in the process. Luxembourg was the worst offender, spending less than 0.5% of its GDP on defense in 2024. However, several major European hitters were also guilty of not committing enough money during that time. France fell just below, hitting about 1.8%, with Germany only spending about 1.2% of its GDP on defense in 2014. Fast forward to 2023, with the Ukraine war a year in, and we see the reversal of the situation start to play out. The 3 nations that were spending 2% or above were still doing so, but they've been joined by several others: Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Finland, Romania, Latvia, Hungary, and the Slovak Republic all reached or broke through the 2% mark. Poland even ascended to the highest military spender in the organization in terms of percentage of GDP by spending 3.9% compared to America's 3.49%. Even those nations that didn't reach the 2% mark in 2023 were increasing their spending. Turkey was the only NATO member to spend less on its defense as a percentage of GDP than it did in 2014. More spending is coming. In July 2024, the BBC published a report on how NATO expects 23 of its 32 members to reach or exceed the 2% target by the end of 2024. The organization's estimates stated that Poland will hit a spend of 4.1% of its GDP, with Estonia claiming second place at 3.4%. The US, the heaviest spender in pure dollar terms, will be third in terms of spending related to GDP with 3.4%. All of that money adds up to create a NATO that's clearly shifted focus in the wake of Putin's invasion. The status quo has been shattered, meaning the many European nations that were happy to underfund their militaries, at least in the sense that they weren't hitting NATO's guidelines, have awakened to the threat Russia presents. The collective message seems clear: NATO is preparing for the potential situation of Russia succeeding in Ukraine before turning its attention to the rest of Europe. In doing so, it's solving the underfunding problem that has plagued it since the early 2010s. There's still a long way to go. After all, committing money to increase defense spending isn't the same as receiving the fruits of that spending. Weapons need to be manufactured, armies need to be strengthened. All of this takes time. Still, Putin will see that NATO's members are united in increasing their spending, creating an even larger obstacle for him should he have designs on invading any of its European members. Therein lies another problem for Putin. It could be argued that the main reason for NATO's weakening during the 2000s and 2010s was that it had no common enemy against which it may need to fight. Fyodor A. Lukyanov touches on this in his previously mentioned piece for Russia in Global Affairs, as he highlights how the European arm of NATO essentially became a political and expansionist organization. It was more concerned with welcoming a handful of new members into the fold while maintaining the status quo it had established in Europe. Defense spending came second because there was no real reason to boost defenses. No country appeared to present enough of a threat to justify that spending. This approach was short-sighted given what we're now seeing from Russia, but Putin's aggression has also served to turn Russia into the common enemy against which NATO's members can unite. This message was made clear during the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, which saw Biden claim that NATO was sending an unmistakable message to the rest of the world. NATO is strong, united, he claimed, before noting that the steps taken during the summit would further augment our collective strength. The Madrid summit was also notable because it was the first that allowed what the US Embassy in Italy dubbed partner nations into the fold. South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand all attended the 2022 summit, with 3 of those nations being countries with which the US has defensive pacts in place. Of course, those countries are more concerned with China's expansion than they are with Russia's, but given that Russia and China are so often seen as allies, even if they don't support each other directly through military cooperation, the presence of these Asian and Australasian nations at the summit was important. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, summed up the general feeling during the summit. What we've seen is a recognition throughout Europe and beyond that the aggression against Ukraine is also an aggression against some very basic principles that do underlie the international order. In other words, Russia has presented itself as a threat to NATO's geopolitical influence, turning itself into a common enemy that has helped to heal the divisions within the organization. The viewpoint was reinforced by the United Kingdom almost 2 years later. On the eve of then Foreign Secretary David Cameron's attendance at a meeting of NATO member state foreign ministers, the UK government emphasised that NATO has never been stronger. It's also never been more relevant or united than it is in 2024, according to the UK government, especially as it's now responsible for protecting over 1 billion people. None of this is to say that there are no disagreements within NATO. It's a collective of 32 nations, each with its agenda, after all. However, Putin's establishment of Russia as a threat to Europe by virtue of his invasion of Ukraine has gelled NATO's membership together. Now the conversation tends to focus on what to do about Russia. How does NATO build its defenses? How can it protect vulnerable nations such as the Baltic states, Finland, and Sweden? Should NATO enter Ukraine and fight directly? In all cases, Russia is the focal point, meaning the collective defense promised by NATO is transforming into a truly collective effort to curb Russian aggression. There's another component to the increased unity between NATO's members that can't be underestimated: the sheer amount those members have spent on supporting Ukraine. In July 2024, NATO countries agreed on a deal in which they'll collectively supply at least 40 billion euros, approximately $43.4 billion in military aid to Ukraine in 2025. That comes on the back of billions of dollars already spent. By February 2024, the US had provided $72.78 billion in aid. European Union institutions had offered up to $32.52 billion, with many of NATO's European members offering several billion dollars to support Ukraine. Those numbers are only growing higher. The US alone approved a $60 billion aid package in April 2024, bringing its total contribution up to around $130 billion. Why does this matter in the context of NATO strengthening? There's an idiom in the UK that goes, "in for a penny, in for a pound." It means that a person is committed to completing an undertaking, no matter how much time, effort, and money it'll take. That's where NATO finds itself in relation to the Ukraine war today. Its member nations have already spent so much money supporting Ukraine that they're not going to back out now. And with that commitment to overcoming Russia via Ukraine comes the renewed unity the entire organization has with Russia established as a common enemy. In short, Russia has pushed NATO to spend more on itself and Ukraine, and the organization isn't going to allow that money to go to waste. It's in it for the long haul financially, which spells bad news for Putin both in terms of his ambitions for Ukraine and whatever he may have had in store for the rest of Europe. Add to all of this that Russia hasn't followed through on any of the threats it's made against NATO so far, which combines with the country's underperformance in Ukraine to suggest that Russia's military is something of a paper tiger. This is a country that's supposed to be in the top 3 in terms of pure military might, and it's bogged down in a war of attrition against a nation that it should have easily overcome. Even with all the financial aid now being supplied to Ukraine, it can't be ignored that Russia's initial smash-and-grab invasion failed, giving Ukraine time to regroup and start appealing to other countries. NATO is stronger both because it's taking Russia more seriously and because Russia has shown itself to be less powerful than it appears on paper. The lack of power breeds confidence, which is why we're seeing NATO moving closer toward the possibility of putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. As mentioned in the introduction to this video, French President Emmanuel Macron already raised that possibility earlier in 2024. In May 2024, officials from the Baltic states also claimed entering Ukraine was a possibility, especially if Russia gained significant ground in Kharkiv. And even before that, the chair of the NATO Military Committee, Lieutenant Admiral Rob Bauer, was claiming that NATO needs to get ready to fight. "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace," he claimed in January 2024. And that's why NATO is preparing for a conflict with Russia. Putin's attempts to intimidate NATO have failed. In fact, they've had the opposite effect than he intended. Rather than cowing NATO into a submissive role, in which it would sit back and watch as he took control of Ukraine, Putin's threat has simply steeled the resolve of NATO members, who feel they're next on his radar. The entrance of NATO troops into Ukraine is more of a possibility than it was in 2022. Even if that doesn't happen, increased spending and a changed attitude toward Russia means that NATO won't be caught napping if Putin tries to push his aggression further. And if he does, he'll be doing so from a weakened state. The Ukraine war has lasted longer than Putin ever anticipated, and it's cost Russia an enormous amount. Figures vary depending on the source, though Ukraine's Ministry of Finance comes out at the high end. It says that Russia has lost around 581,000 military personnel, in addition to 8,406 tanks, more than 16,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 16,000 artillery systems. Russia is burning through people, equipment, and munitions at a time when NATO member nations are spending more and rebuilding their militaries. Putin also has to deal with his attempts to create a Russian NATO faltering. Though he has signed a mutual defense deal with North Korea, he's also had to watch the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, disintegrate around him. Created in May 1992, the CSTO started as a collective of 6 former Soviet or Soviet-aligned nations, including Russia, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Georgia, Belarus, and Azerbaijan joined in the years that followed, with Russia's goal being to create an organization similar to NATO, only with nations that could fall under its influence. Uzbekistan left the CSTO in 2012. According to The Hill in March 2024, Armenia is going to follow suit. The country suspended its participation in CSTO in 2018, following a people-powered revolution that installed Nikol Pashinyan as its prime minister. Armenia also feels betrayed by Russia, not least because Putin failed to broker a peace deal over the blockading of the Lachin corridor by Azerbaijan that resulted in 100,000 Armenians being displaced. That gives NATO the opportunity to strengthen itself further by weakening Russia. NATO could play on what's happened to Armenia to show that Russia isn't capable of supporting its supposed allies during times of crisis. The Hill says that NATO could subtly remind neutral nations, and those that lean towards supporting Russia, such as Belarus, Syria, and Venezuela, that Putin has established himself as a man who doesn't come through for his supposed friends. Russia's influence in Europe would thus diminish, strengthening NATO even further. So where does all of this leave Putin? It's unlikely that he's going to change course, with victory in Ukraine being practically essential for him to maintain his strongman image, and by extension his place at the head of the Kremlin. Still, his actions in Ukraine have prompted NATO to stand up and take notice. Its members are spending more than they ever have before on their militaries. The group has grown larger, adding 2 new members since the war began, and all but guaranteeing membership to Ukraine if it can pull through the war. And perhaps worst of all for Putin, he's managed to unite NATO against a common enemy after several decades of complacency, at least on the European side of the alliance. All of this spells bad news for any future ambitions he harbors for Europe, as well as means that NATO-aligned nations are going to keep funding Ukraine to keep him from establishing a power base deeper into Europe. But what do you think about NATO's strengthening? Is it enough for the organization to contain the Russian threat, or do you believe that Putin will continue on a campaign of aggression should Russia defeat Ukraine? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.